Grandpa's toy gun. That's what the kid in the $500 plate carrier said when the old Marine limped up to the firing line with a wooden stocked rifle older than the parking lot itself. The weekend shooters laughed. One lifted his phone to record, another tucked his AR-15 tighter and muttered about letting the antique have its moment. The old man never looked at them. He set a single 15-round magazine on the bench, slid it into the receiver, and stared down the iron sights at a steel plate 200 yards away. None of them knew that what they were about to witness would shut every one of them up for the rest of their lives. If you believe the old guard still has something to teach the young, type the word respect in the comments before you watch what happens next. The old Marine's name was Walter Hennessy, though the few people who still called him by name mostly used Walt. He was 78 years old, 6'1" when he was 40, and an inch shorter every decade since. His left knee carried a piece of metal a Navy surgeon had put in him in 1968, and on cold mornings the metal woke up before he did. This particular Saturday in late September was not cold. It was that strange high desert warmth that smelled like sage and gunpowder before noon. But the knee was complaining anyway, the way old wounds complain when they sense something coming. He drove a 1994 Ford F-25 of the colour of dried mud. The radio still worked. The air conditioning did not. On the passenger seat sat a brown leather rifle case, cracked along the seams from 40 years of being lifted in and out of trucks, and beside it a thermos of black coffee his late wife Marguerite had bought him at a gas station in Reno in 1989. He had not let anyone refill that thermos with anyone else's coffee since she died in March. The carbine inside the leather case had a story longer than most men's lives. It was an Inland Division M1, manufactured in 1943 at a plant in Detroit, and the front sight had a small notch in it from a piece of Japanese shrapnel that had grazed it on the black sand of Iwo Jima. The man who'd carried it onto that beach was Walt's father, Sergeant Daniel Hennessy of the 28th Marines. The man who'd carried it through the snow at the Chosine Reservoir was Walt's older brother Patrick, who never came home. The man who'd carried it through 3 tours of the Republic of Vietnam, including one that ended in a place the official record still called Operation Tailwind Adjacent, was Walt himself. But on that September morning in 2023, none of the weekend shooters at the public range outside Carson City, Nevada saw any of that history. They saw an old man with a limp, a rusted-out truck, and a wooden rifle they assumed had been passed down from a grandpa who had probably never fired a shot in anger. They were about to learn that not everything weathered is weak, and that some men carry their war stories not on their chests, but in the calluses between their thumb and forefinger, calluses that come from 40,000 rounds of practice with the same rifle their father bled for. What none of them knew yet was that Walt Hennessy had not come to that range to shoot for fun. He had come because he had a promise to keep, and he had exactly 1 week left to keep it. The range was called High Desert Tactical, and on Saturdays it filled up with the kind of crowd that gave honest civilian shooters a bad name. The owner, a soft-spoken man named Carl Weems, who'd been a Navy corpsman in the late 1980s, kept the place clean and the rules posted in 3 places, but he could not legislate humility into the men who came through his gate. The rifle bay was 100 yards wide with shooting benches every 6 feet, sandbags worn smooth from a decade of elbows, and a row of steel silhouettes set out at 50, 100, 200 and 300 yards. The 200-yard plates had been repainted bright orange that morning so they would be easy to call hits on. Walt arrived at 9:45. He paid the $18 range fee in cash, took the laminated safety briefing card from Carl without needing to read it, and walked out to bench 17, the one closest to the spotter's shed, because his eyes were not what they used to be and the shade helped. He set the leather case down. He did not open it yet. He sat on the bench for a long minute, both hands flat on the wood, and watched the shadow of a hawk slide across the dirt. The other group arrived at 10:05 in 3 trucks with custom decals on the back windows. There were 5 of them. Their leader, though no one would have called him that to his face, was a man named Brett Cantrell, 31 years old, an assistant manager at a sporting goods store in Reno, who had recently taken what he called a tactical carbine course from an instructor he had found on Instagram. Brett had a beard the magazines told him to grow, a plate carrier loaded with steel plates he did not need, and an AR-15 that had cost him $3,400 after the optics, the suppressor, the muzzle brake, and the foregrip he had bought in 3 different colours before settling on flat, dark earth. His friends were variations on the same theme. Tyler, the youngest, 24, recording everything on a phone for a YouTube channel that had 211 subscribers. Devon, the loudest, an ex-college lacrosse player who had never served. Marcus, the quietest, who had actually done 4 years in the Army National Guard and ought to have known better. And a guy everyone called Goose, because he had crashed a jet ski once. They unloaded their gear like men unloading furniture into a model home, slowly, with great pride, making sure every neighbour saw it. Brett caught sight of Walt's leather case as he walked past bench 17, and he laughed out loud before he could stop himself. He nudged Tyler. Tyler raised the phone, and from that moment forward, every single second of what was about to happen was being recorded on a device that would, in less than 72 hours, be viewed by a man with 3 stars on his collar who had set down his coffee cup so hard it cracked the saucer beneath it. Walt opened the leather case at 10:11. He did it the way he did everything, without ceremony, without hurry, and with the quiet attention of a man who had been told once, 55 years ago, that the difference between a Marine who came home and one who did not was often nothing more than the speed of his fingers and the slowness of his breathing. The carbine came out of the case stock first. He set it gently on the rolled towel he had brought from home. He pulled the bolt back to check the chamber. He let the bolt forward. He set the safety. Then he stood up with the help of his right hand on the bench and limped over to the spotter's shed to retrieve a folding chair. Brett was at bench 13, 4 spots down, and he had been waiting for an audience. As Walt passed, Brett said, just loud enough to carry, "Hey, old timer, you sure you don't want to start at 50? 200's a long pull for that little pop gun." His friend snickered. Tyler swung the camera around to catch Walt's face. Walt did not look at Brett. He did not look at the camera. He retrieved the folding chair and limped back to bench 17. He set the chair down. He sat. He took a sip of cold coffee from Marguerite's thermos. Devon, the loud one, decided to escalate. "Sir," he called out in the exaggerated voice young men use when they want everyone to know they are being polite while they are being cruel, "do you need help loading that thing? I think my dad's got a .22 in the truck if the kick on that one's too much." A few people at the other benches laughed. Most didn't. An older couple at bench 5 looked over with the kind of expression that said they had seen this before and did not approve, but did not want to get involved either. A father and son at bench 11, the boy maybe 12 years old, went quiet and watched. Walt finally spoke. His voice was lower than they expected, with a faint rasp that suggested either a lot of cigarettes a long time ago or a piece of his throat that had been touched by something he never talked about. "I'm fine," he said. That was all. Brett's smirk widened. He took it as permission. "Tell you what, Gramps," he said, walking down the line toward bench 17 with his chest out. "First round of beers is on the guy who hits the 200 plate first. You in?" Walt looked up at him. He had the kind of eyes that did not blink as much as other people's, the kind of eyes that had spent years looking through scopes and through tree lines, and through the thin grey light just before dawn in places where blinking too long could kill a man. He looked at Brett for what felt to Brett like a very long time. "Sure," Walt said. Brett walked back to his bench laughing. He told the others Walt had taken the bet. Goose whooped. Marcus, the guard veteran, shifted uncomfortably and looked over at Walt and looked away. Tyler made sure the camera caught the distance. 200 yards of dirt and sage and an orange steel rectangle waiting at the end. The shooting began at 10:26. Brett went first, by unspoken agreement that he was the alpha of his little pack. He settled behind his $3,400 rifle, dialed his variable power optic up to 12, took a breath the way the Instagram instructor had told him to take it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot kicked up a small puff of dust about 3 feet to the left of the steel plate. Brett blinked. He adjusted. He fired again. Another puff, this one short and below. By his 5th shot he had finally rung the steel, once, and his friends were cheering as if he had just won a prize. He turned to grin at them, then at Walt. "Beat that, Gramps." Devon went next. He missed his first 3, connected on his 4th, missed 2 more. Hit 1 more. Tyler was filming the whole thing as if it were a triumph. Goose did not even hit the plate. After 8 shots he gave up and switched to the 100-yard target, claiming the wind was bad. There was no wind. Marcus shot calmly and connected 3 of 7. He did not celebrate. He kept glancing over at Walt, who had still not loaded his rifle. Walt was sitting in his folding chair, drinking coffee, watching the silhouettes at 300 yards. Marcus knew, the way people who have served sometimes know, that Walt was not measuring those silhouettes the way the rest of them were measuring them. Marcus could not have said how he knew, but he knew. Tyler took his turn. His AR-15 was the cheapest of the groups, but it was fitted with the most expensive optic. He missed 11 straight shots before connecting. By that point, the laughter from the other benches was beginning to die down, replaced by a kind of awkward shuffling. The father at bench 11 leaned over and whispered something to his son. The boy nodded slowly, eyes wide. Brett, frustrated by his own performance and looking for somewhere to put the frustration, turned again toward Walt. "All right, old man, let's see what that museum piece can do." Walt set down the thermos. He stood up slowly. The metal in his knee complained. He put one hand on the bench and the other on the carbine, and he limped to the firing line. Tyler swung the camera around. He zoomed in on the rifle first. The wooden stock was darkened in places by oil and time. The metal had the soft grey patina of a thing that had been carried for a very long time by hands that knew how to carry it. There was a small notch in the front sight that the camera caught for half a second before Tyler panned up to Walt's face. What Tyler did not know, what no one at that range knew, except possibly Carl Weems, who had stepped out of his office and was standing very still in the doorway with his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed, was that the video he was about to record was going to leave his phone within the hour, get forwarded twice, and end up on the personal cell of a Marine 3-star general who had spent the last 19 years looking for a man whose name he only knew from a single line in a declassified after-action report. And that general was about to recognise the rifle before he recognised the face. Walt didn't load the carbine immediately. He stood at the firing line with the rifle resting against his shoulder, muzzle pointed downrange and safely up, and he closed his eyes for a count of 3. Inside those 3 seconds, he was not at High Desert Tactical. He was 19 years old, lying belly down in elephant grass that smelled like rotting fruit and copper, and his father's voice was inside his head saying what his father had said to him on the porch the night before he shipped out. "It's not a tool, Walter. It's a promise. You make the promise to it. It makes the promise back to you. You take care of it. It'll take care of you. You forget that. You'll come home in a box and your mother will never forgive me for letting you go." He had taken care of it. For 60 years he had taken care of it. The action was clean. The springs had been replaced once in 1972 by a Marine armourer at Camp Pendleton who'd grown up on the same kind of rifle and refused to let Walt pay him. The barrel had been recrowned in 1991 by a gunsmith in Carson City who had seen the notch in the front sight and asked, without much expression, if the rifle had been at Suribachi. Walt had nodded once, and the gunsmith had not charged him either. Walt had fired roughly 40,000 rounds through that rifle over the course of his life. He had cleaned it after every single session. He had carried it across 3 continents and into 4 different kinds of weather that could rust a lesser gun in a week. He could disassemble it blindfolded. He had, in fact, done so blindfolded, once on a bet in a Marine bar in Da Nang in 1967, and the bartender had bought him a beer for it that he still remembered the taste of. The carbine was not, in any technical sense, a precision rifle. Its effective range against a man-sized target was generally listed at 300 yards, and most modern shooters would have laughed at the idea of using one for serious marksmanship at 200. The .30 carbine cartridge it fired was a pistol-class round dressed up in a long case. The iron sights were a flip-up aperture and a simple post. There was no scope. There would never be a scope. But Walt Hennessy had spent more time with that rifle than most marriages last. He knew, the way a violinist knows their instrument, exactly where each shot would go. He knew the trigger break to the half-ounce. He knew the report, the recoil, the way the wood warmed against his cheek after the 3rd round. He knew the small drift to the right at distances over 150 yards, and exactly how much to compensate for it without thinking. The rifle and the man were not, at this point in his life, 2 separate objects. They were one thing. He opened his eyes. He brought the rifle up. He inserted the magazine. He chambered a round. Behind him, Brett said something else. Walt did not hear it. Walt's first shot left the muzzle at 10:31 and 17 seconds. The crack of a .30 carbine is a sharper, smaller sound than the heavy bark of an AR-15. Several of the men at the other benches glanced over the way people glance at a child's firework after watching a real one. Tyler, behind his phone, almost laughed. Then the steel rang. 200 yards down range, the bright orange plate jumped on its chain and let out a clean, bell-like clang that carried back across the dirt. Carl Weems, in the doorway of his office, allowed the corner of his mouth to lift 1 millimeter. Walt did not react. He did not look at the others. He did not lower the rifle. He worked the bolt. The carbine cycled itself, of course. He did not need to work the bolt, but his hand checked the ejection port out of a 60-year habit, and he settled the front sight again. The second shot was fired 4 seconds after the first. The plate rang. The third shot was fired 4 seconds after the second. The plate rang. By the 4th shot, Brett had stopped talking. By the 5th shot, no one at any bench was talking. Tyler had forgotten he was filming. Had forgotten Devon's mouth was open. Goose was staring downrange as if he had just watched the laws of physics reorganize themselves in front of him. Marcus, the National Guard veteran, had taken one slow step backward from his bench and put his hand on his chest, very lightly, in a gesture he was not aware of making. 5 shots, 5 hits, at 200 yards, with iron sights, with a .30 carbine, by a 78-year-old man with a metal knee, fired so clean and so fast that the echoes of the steel were still bouncing off the berm when the last casing hit the dirt. Walt lowered the rifle. He set the safety. He ejected the magazine, caught it in his palm, and slid it into the chest pocket of his denim shirt. He turned away from the firing line without looking at anyone, walked back to his folding chair and sat down. He picked up Marguerite's thermos. He took a sip of coffee. The silence at High Desert Tactical lasted, by Tyler's late account from the video, 11 full seconds. 11 seconds in which not a single round was fired by any of the 22 paying customers at the range that morning. Not a single voice spoke, not a single phone rang. Just the soft sound of the wind in the sage and the slow creak of the steel plate still rocking slightly on its chain. Brett broke the silence. He tried to laugh. It came out wrong. "Lucky?" he said. The word landed in the silence like a coin dropped on a marble floor. Louder than he meant, and embarrassing. Marcus turned and looked at Brett the way a man looks at a child who has just said something stupid in front of his grandmother. He did not speak. He just looked. Tyler, however, was looking at his phone. He had the video. He had every second of it, the mockery, the shooting, the silence, the moment Walt picked up his thermos. And Tyler, who had spent the last 2 years trying to grow a YouTube channel that no one watched, knew with the certainty of a young man who has finally caught lightning that this video was about to be seen. He was right. He just did not yet understand by whom. By 11:15 that morning, Tyler had uploaded a 1 minute and 52-second cut of the video to 3 platforms. He had titled it, with the breathless punctuation of his generation, "Old Marine Humbles Tactical Bros with WW's Carbine, 5 for 5 at 200 yards. He had not asked Walt's permission. He had not even asked Walt's name. The caption identified Walt only as this absolute legend, and noted, in a sentence Tyler thought was generous of him, that the old guy can shoot. By noon, the video had 900 views. By 2 o'clock, it had 11,000. By 4, it had crossed 100,000 and was being shared in firearms forums, veteran groups, Marine Corps Facebook pages, and one small but very active subreddit dedicated to historical military rifles. At 6:32 that evening, in a townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, a Marine 3-star general named Robert Halverson sat down at his kitchen table with a glass of bourbon and a plate of leftover pot roast his wife had warmed up for him. He opened his phone to scroll through the news. A friend had texted him the video 20 minutes earlier with the message, "Bob, watch this. Tell me if I'm crazy." General Halverson pressed play. He watched for 14 seconds before he set down the bourbon. He watched for another 8 before he leaned forward, very slowly until his face was 18 inches from the screen. He watched the entire video twice. He paused it on the close-up of the rifle. He zoomed in on the front sight. He saw the notch. He set the phone down on the table. He placed both palms flat on either side of it. He stared at the wall above the stove for 30 seconds without blinking. Then he picked up the phone again, and he opened a contact in his directory that he had not called in 11 years. The contact was a retired colonel in Pensacola, Florida, a man named Ed Garrison, who had served as an intelligence officer at MACV SOG in 1968, and had been the only living American witness to a thing that happened in a place called the Outshot Valley on the night of November 4th of that year. Halverson waited 2 rings. Garrison answered. "Ed," Halverson said, "I need you to look at a video. I think we found him." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Garrison said, in a voice that had aged 40 years in the last 2 seconds, "Send it." Halverson sent it. He waited. After 3 minutes, his phone rang back. "Where?" Garrison said. He could not finish the sentence. "Carson City, Nevada, public range, this morning." Another silence. Then, "Bob, he's 78 years old. We owe him a goddamn apology." "I know," Halverson said. "I'm on a plane in the morning." He was. He boarded a military transport out of Andrews at 5:45 a.m., wearing his service uniform with 3 silver stars on each collar and a ribbon rack that started at the Navy Cross and worked downward. He landed at Reno Stead at 9:10 local time. A black SUV was waiting for him on the tarmac. He arrived at High Desert Tactical at 10:53 a.m. on Sunday morning, exactly 24 hours and 22 minutes after the first round from Walt Hennessy's M1 carbine had rung the orange steel plate. Walt, of course, did not know about the video. He did not have a smartphone. He had a flip phone he used to call his daughter in Idaho once a week, and to call his doctor's office in Carson City when he needed to. He had not gone home to check email. He had in fact been at the range every day that weekend, both Saturday and Sunday, because he had told himself he would shoot 1 full magazine through his father's rifle every day for the 7 days leading up to the 80th anniversary of the landing on Iwo Jima, which was the promise he had made to his father in 1998, on the day his father died. He was on day 5 of 7. When he pulled into the gravel lot at High Desert Tactical at 9:40 that Sunday morning, he noticed two things that he would not have expected. The first was that the lot was nearly full, which was unusual for a Sunday before 10. The second was that several of the men standing around the entrance turned to look at him as he parked the F250 and then looked away too quickly. Walt did not think much of it. He picked up the leather case. He picked up Marguerite's thermos. He limped toward the office. Carl Weems was waiting at the door. "Walt," Carl said, in a tone Walt had not heard from him in 8 years of weekend visits. Could I speak with you for a minute before you head out to the bay?" Walt nodded. He followed Carl into the office. Carl shut the door. He stood for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, gathering something. "There's a video," Carl said. Walt waited. "Of you, from yesterday. Some kid filmed it. It's been seen by a lot of people." Walt's expression did not change. He set the case down on Carl's desk. "How many?" "Last I checked, about 2 million. Walt looked at him. He blinked once. "Of me shooting? Of you shooting, and of those guys mocking you before you shot? Walt, they look like fools. The whole internet is calling them fools, and there's something else." "What?" Carl took a breath. "There's a Marine general flying out to see you. Bob Halverson. 3 stars. He called me last night at 11 my time. He's landing in about an hour." Walt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Halverson. You know him?" "I knew his father." Carl waited. "His father was a Marine captain," Walt said. "He was killed in November of 68. The boy, Robert, was 3 years old. I went to the funeral." Carl did not know what to say to that. Walt picked up the leather case. He picked up the thermos. "Carl," Walt said, "I'd like to shoot my magazine before he gets here, if that's all right." "That's fine, Walt. The bay's clear for you. I told everyone else the line is closed for an hour." Walt nodded. He limped out of the office and toward bench 17. He did not see, as he walked, that Brett Cantrell and his 4 friends were standing at the far end of the parking lot, by the gate, clutching their rifle cases and looking like men who had come to say something they did not know how to say. They had been there since 8 a.m. They had not slept much. The video had reached each of them at different points in the previous evening, and each of them had spent the night discovering, one comment at a time, what kind of man they had laughed at on Saturday morning. What they did not yet know, what they would learn within the hour, when General Halverson stepped out of the black SUV and walked across the gravel toward bench 17 and stopped 6 feet from Walt Hennessy, and slowly, deliberately raised his right hand to the brim of his cover, was that the rifle they had called a toy had once saved a Marine captain's son from growing up without ever knowing his father's last words. Walt fired his magazine. 15 rounds. He did not shoot at the orange plates this time. Carl had set up, at Walt's quiet request the day before, a single piece of paper at 100 yards, a standard pistol silhouette with a 4-inch black circle in the chest. Walt fired all 15 rounds into that black circle, in 3 groups of 5, in the time it would take a young man to read the safety briefing card he had been handed at the gate. When he was finished, he set the rifle down. He stood at the firing line for a long moment, looking out across the dirt and the sage and the brown hills beyond. He did not pray exactly. He had stopped praying with words a long time ago, but he held a thought the way a man holds a small flame against the wind. "I am keeping the promise, Pop. 5 days down, 2 to go. I'll see you Wednesday." When he turned around, the black SUV had pulled into the lot. The driver was a young Marine in service alphas. He came around the vehicle and opened the rear passenger door. General Robert Halverson stepped out into the dust. Halverson was 60 years old, lean, with hair that had gone grey at the temples and a face that had spent decades in too many sunbright places. The 3 silver stars on his collar caught the morning light. His ribbons started at the Navy Cross, the highest decoration the Department of the Navy could award, second only to the Medal of Honor, and ran down across his chest in 2 neat columns. He carried his cover under his left arm. He walked across the gravel without hurry. Brett Cantrell and his 4 friends by the gate watched him pass and did not breathe. Tyler did not raise his phone. Halverson stopped 6 feet from Walt. He looked at the carbine on the bench. He looked at the leather case. He looked at the notch in the front sight from the angle that allowed him to see it. Then he looked at Walt's face. For perhaps 8 seconds the 2 men simply looked at each other. The general's eyes filled slowly and without shame until they did not quite spill. Walt's did not. Walt's eyes were what they had been since the morning of November the 5th, 1968, clear, steady, and a little farther away than any other man's at the table. The general spoke first. His voice was low. He had to clear his throat twice before the words came out the way he wanted them. "Master Sergeant Hennessy," he said. Walt did not correct the rank, though he had retired as a gunnery sergeant. Halverson had used the rank Walt's record book had shown him as wearing the night his father had died. It was a deliberate choice, and Walt understood it. "General," Walt said. Halverson drew himself up to attention. He raised his right hand to the brim of his cover in a slow, deliberate salute. He held it. "Sir," Halverson said, "on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, on behalf of my mother, who is 91 years old and who still keeps your letter on her nightstand, on behalf of my father, who I was told, by men I trusted, would have wanted me to find you and thank you face to face if it took the rest of my career." He paused. His hand did not lower. "And on behalf of the 3-year-old boy who got to grow up because of what you did in the Ashau Valley in November of 1968, thank you, Gunnery Sergeant. Thank you." Walt slowly raised his own right hand. He returned the salute. The two men held it for 4 seconds. Behind them, Brett Cantrell sat down in the gravel, very abruptly, and put his face in his hands. Halverson lowered his salute. Walt lowered his. The general took 1 step forward and put his hand very gently on Walt's shoulder. Then he turned, with Walt beside him, and the two of them walked slowly back to the spotter's shed where Carl had set out 2 folding chairs in the shade. Walt's leather case and the carbine came with them. Halverson carried the case himself. What Halverson explained, in the soft and unhurried voice of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his head for 19 years and was finally permitted to have it out loud, was a story that Walt had never told anyone. Not his wife, not his daughter, not his pastor, not the VIA counsellor he had been required to see for 8 months in the late 70s. He had not told it because he had been ordered, in writing, in 1969, not to tell it. The order had come from a brigadier general in the office of the Secretary of Defence. The mission had been classified at a level above top secret. The participants had been 7 Marines and 2 CIA officers. 5 of the Marines had died on the mission. The 2 CIA officers had died within 18 months of returning. That left Walt and a Marine captain named James Halverson, who had been wounded so severely on the extraction that he had not survived the helicopter ride to the field hospital in Pubai. Captain James Halverson had been Robert Halverson's father. What Walt had done, what the after-action report described in the dry, declassified language of 1993, when the mission was finally unsealed, was to carry Captain Halverson across 2 miles of jungle, under fire for the first 300 yards, with his left knee already shattered by a rifle bullet that had passed through him at the second-to-last firefight. Walt had used the M1 carbine, his father's rifle, his brother's rifle, the rifle he had not been authorised to carry but had brought anyway, to lay down covering fire one-handed while dragging the captain with the other. He had killed, by the count in the report, 11 enemy combatants in the running engagement. He had reached the extraction point. He had loaded the captain onto the helicopter himself. He had refused to board until every other surviving member of the team was aboard. He had, in the words of the report, displayed conspicuous gallantry above and beyond any reasonable expectation of duty. He had been recommended twice for the Medal of Honor. The award had been blocked, twice, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging the mission, which the United States government had spent 18 years insisting had never happened. He had been quietly given the Navy Cross in 1993, in a ceremony attended by 4 people in a small room at Camp Pendleton. He had not worn the medal once. It was in a drawer in a dresser in his bedroom in Carson City, beneath a folded American flag and a photograph of Marguerite at 22. Captain James Halverson had lived for 41 minutes after Walt loaded him onto the helicopter. In those 41 minutes, he had dictated a letter to a corpsman. The letter had been 4 sentences long. It had been addressed to his wife, with instructions to read it to his son when the boy was old enough to understand. The 4th sentence of that letter was, "Tell Walter Hennessy that I owe him a debt I can't pay, and that the boy is to find him someday and pay it for me." Halverson finished telling the story. He did not look at Walt as he told it. He looked at the carbine resting across his lap. "I have been looking for you," he said, "since I was 41 years old. The records had your last known address as a P.O. box in Reno that closed in 1986. I tried. I never found you. And then a kid uploads a video to the internet and there you are." Walt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you found me." Halverson's eyes filled again. This time he let them. What neither of them yet knew, though they would know within the next 48 hours, because the President of the United States had been forwarded the same video by his Chief of Staff at 6 a.m. that morning, was that the Medal of Honor that had been blocked twice was about to be approved on a 3rd recommendation that had been signed that very morning by the Commandant of the Marine Corps himself. The two of them sat in the shade for another 20 minutes. The general talked about his mother, who would want to meet Walt as soon as Walt was willing to make the trip. He talked about his own son, named James after his father, who was a captain himself now, deployed somewhere Halverson could not say. He talked about the letter on the nightstand, the letter Walt had written to Mary Halverson in March of 1969, 3 sentences in his careful handwriting, telling her only that her husband had been the bravest man he had ever served with, and that he was sorry he could not say more. Walt listened. He did not interrupt. Now and then he nodded. Once, when Halverson mentioned that his mother had read the letter aloud to him every birthday until he turned 18, Walt closed his eyes and kept them closed for a count of 3. When the general was finished, Walt finally spoke at length. It was the most words anyone at High Desert Tactical had heard him say in 8 years of weekend visits. "Your father," Walt said, "was the best officer I ever served under. He was 26 years old. He could have stayed at the rear. He did not stay at the rear. He went out on every patrol he sent his men on. The night we got hit, he was on point. Not because we needed him on point, because he believed he should be on point. When the first round went into him, he put his hand up to stop the rest of us from advancing into the kill zone. He saved 7 men with that hand before he ever opened his mouth to give an order." He paused. "I owed him my life before he ever owed me his. I have spent 55 years trying to pay back what he gave me. Every time I cleaned this rifle, every time I taught a young Marine to shoot, every time I sat at a Memorial Day parade and watched the colours go past, I was paying back your father." He looked at Halverson. "The debt is not yours. Son, there is no debt. There never was." Halverson could not speak for a moment. When he could, he said, "Sir, I'd like to disagree with you, with respect, but I'd like to disagree." Walt almost smiled. "You can disagree." "I will," the general said, "for the rest of my life." A few yards away, by the gate, Brett Cantrell was still sitting in the gravel. Tyler was standing over him, the phone now lowered, the camera off. Marcus had walked away from the group and was standing alone at the edge of the lot looking out at the desert. Devon and Goose were not visible. They had walked back to their truck and were sitting inside it with the doors closed. Carl Weems had quietly approached the shed. He stood at a respectful distance until Halverson looked up at him and nodded. "There are 5 young men by the gate," Carl said, "who would very much like to apologise to Mr. Hennessy, if he is willing to receive them." Walt looked at Halverson. Halverson looked back. Neither of them said anything. The choice was Walt's. Walt thought about it for 10 seconds. Then he said, "Send them over, one at a time." Brett came first. He walked the 30 yards from the gate to the shed like a man walking to a sentence. When he reached Walt, he could not speak at first. He tried twice. The third time he managed to say, "Sir, I am so sorry for what I said, for what I did. There is nothing I can... There is nothing..." Walt let him stop. He let him stand there in the silence. Then he said in the same quiet voice he had used to say "I'm fine" the day before, "Sit down, son." Brett sat. He sat in the dirt beside the shed. "What do you do for work?" Walt asked. I work at a sporting goods store, sir." "Do you teach the people who come in to shoot?" "Sometimes, sir." "Then I want you to remember this. Every time someone comes in there with an old rifle and you think you know more than they do, I want you to remember this morning. Will you do that?" Brett's face was wet. He nodded. "Good," Walt said. "Stand up, shake my hand." Brett stood. They shook hands. Walt's grip was firmer than Brett expected. The other 4 came after Brett, one by one, in the order Walt had requested. Tyler came second. He apologised for the video, offered to take it down. Walt thought about it and shook his head. "Leave it up," he said, "but put a new title on it, put the captain's name on it, James Halverson. People should know who I was shooting for." Tyler nodded and said he would. He did that afternoon, with the new title written by General Halverson himself. Devon came third. He apologised in the loud way he had mocked, and Walt accepted it in the quiet way he had endured. Goose came fourth, mumbled something about the jet ski incident as if it were relevant, and Walt let him talk and then nodded once, and that was that. Marcus came last. He did not apologise at first. He stood at the entrance of the shed and waited for permission to speak. Walt gave it. "Gunnery Sergeant," Marcus said. "I knew. I want you to know that I knew. The minute you sat down in that chair I knew, and I didn't say anything, and that was wrong of me. And I'm sorry." Walt looked at him for a long moment. He had recognised Marcus too, the slight hesitation in the shoulders, the way the man held his head a half-degree to the right when he listened, the absence of certain joking gestures that civilians made and veterans usually didn't. Walt had seen, the day before, a man who had served and who had not stopped one of the cruelties. "What was your unit?" Walt asked. 2nd Battalion, 155 Field Artillery, Idaho Guard. I was a forward observer, 2009 through 2013. "You know what we used to say about forward observers in my time?" "No, sir." "That a good foe is the difference between a fight and a slaughter. You know what kind of fight you saw yesterday?" "A slaughter, sir." "And you didn't call in the right round, that's all. Next time you call it in. That's the apology I want from you." Marcus nodded. His eyes were wet too. He did not try to hide it. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the parking lot at High Desert Tactical was nearly empty. The General's SUV had taken Walt and Halverson into Carson City for lunch, at a diner Walt had been eating at since 1974. The waitress, a woman named Linda, who had served Walt his Sunday Turkey Club for 30 years, recognised the General's stars and brought a second pot of coffee without being asked. She did not ask what was going on. She knew Walt well enough not to. Walt's daughter, Sarah, was driving down from Boise. She had seen the video at 6 in the morning, called Walt at 6:03, gotten no answer, called Carl at 6:15, and been on the road by 7. She would arrive at 6:40 that evening. She would walk into Walt's house and find her father sitting at the kitchen table with a Marine 3-star general drinking instant coffee out of mismatched mugs, and she would put her hand over her mouth and stand in the doorway and cry quietly for a full minute before either man got up to hug her. What no one knew yet, though Halverson would find out at 4:30 the next morning, when his phone rang with the Pentagon's caller ID flashing on the screen, was that the Medal of Honor recommendation had not just been signed by the Commandant. It had been forwarded to the White House the same night, and the White House was not waiting 19 years this time. The ceremony was being scheduled for the morning of February 23rd, exactly 2 months from that day, on the 81st anniversary of the raising of the flag over Mount Suribachi, and it was going to be held in the East Room of the White House, with the carbine on a velvet cushion beside the protagonist of a story that the United States government had spent 55 years pretending had not happened. The video, by the end of that week, had been viewed 41 million times. The story moved from social media to the morning news shows to the evening news to the front page of newspapers in cities Walt had never visited. The Marine Corps released a statement on the Wednesday, drafted personally by the Commandant, confirming that Gunnery Sergeant Walter Hennessy, retired, had served with distinction in 3 combat tours in the Republic of Vietnam, and that his actions in November of 1968 had been a credit to the Corps and to the nation. The 5 young men from the parking lot did not, contrary to what some commenters online predicted, become villains. Brett quit the sporting goods store. He took a job as an apprentice gunsmith with the same man in Carson City who had recrowned Walt's barrel in 1991. The man, it turned out, was happy to take him on as long as Brett agreed to work the front counter and learn humility from the customers. Tyler turned his YouTube channel over to telling the stories of older veterans with their permission, and within 6 months had 200,000 subscribers. Devon went home to Reno and did not say much for several weeks, and then he enlisted in the Marine Corps at the age of 28. Goose became, of all things, an Eagle Scout Merit Badge counselor for rifle shooting at his nephew's troop. Marcus reached out to Walt by letter 2 weeks later, and asked if Walt would be willing to mentor him on something Marcus had been thinking about for years, opening a small training program for veterans recovering from PTSD, using marksmanship as a discipline of attention. Walt said yes. The promise to his father was kept. On Wednesday, the 80th anniversary of the landing on Iwo Jima, Walt drove out to the range at sunrise with Halverson beside him in the F-250. The General had stayed in town the extra 2 days, partly because he wanted to, and partly because his wife had told him over the phone in clear language that he was not to leave Carson City until he had finished what his father had started. Walt fired 1 full magazine through the carbine into the orange plate at 200 yards. Halverson stood beside him at parade rest. Carl Weems stood 20 feet behind them, hat in hand. The plate rang 15 times. When Walt was finished, he handed the carbine to Halverson. The General, who was not a man who cried often, accepted it without quite trusting himself to speak. Walt cleared his throat. "I'd like you to have this," Walt said. "When I'm gone, not before, but after. It belongs in your family. It's been waiting for your father to get it back since November of 68. If you'll have it." Halverson could not speak for a moment. Then he said, "Sir, I'll have it. I'll have it for the rest of my life. And when I'm gone, my son will have it. And we will care for it the way you have cared for it." Walt nodded. He took the rifle back. He laid it gently in the leather case. 2 months later, in the East Room of the White House on the morning of February 23rd, the President of the United States placed a pale blue ribbon around Walter Hennessy's neck and read aloud the citation for the Medal of Honor that should have been awarded 55 years earlier. Walt stood at attention through the entire reading, his back as straight as the metal in his knee would permit. Behind him, in the second row of the audience, sat Mary Halverson, 91 years old, in a wheelchair, in her Sunday best, and beside her, holding her hand, was her son, the General. In the third row sat Brett, Tyler, Marcus, Devon, and Goose, in coats and ties, who had been personally invited by Walt, because Walt was a man who believed that the men who had needed the lesson the most were the ones who had earned the right to see it finished. Walt Hennessy lived for 4 more years after the ceremony. He spent those years quietly, the way he had always spent his time. He drove the F-250 until the second to last week. He drank his coffee out of Marguerite's thermos every morning. He spoke at a small Marine Corps League event in Reno once at General Halverson's request, and he told the audience of 72 old veterans the story of his father's rifle, from Iwo Jima to Chosin to Vietnam to Carson City. He did not tell the story of November 5th, 1968. Halverson had asked him beforehand if he would. Walt had said no, gently. "That's not my story to tell," Walt had said. "That's the captain's story. You tell it." He died in the fall of his 82nd year, in his own bed, with his daughter Sarah holding one hand and General Robert Halverson holding the other. The carbine was in the leather case at the foot of the bed. The Medal of Honor was in its presentation box on the dresser. Marguerite's thermos was on the kitchen counter, washed and dry, where Sarah found it the next morning and did not have the heart to put away. The carbine went, as Walt had asked, to General Halverson, who had it cleaned one final time by the gunsmith in Carson City, and then placed it in a glass case in his study in Arlington. The notch in the front sight is still there, so is the patina on the stock, so is the small dark stain on the wooden handguard. The one Walt would never quite explain, the one Halverson now believes, though he cannot prove, came from the night his father bled in his arms in the Eshau Valley, and Walt held them both with the rifle braced across his lap. If you watched the video that started this story, you saw 5 shots ring on a steel plate at 200 yards. What you did not see, because no camera could film it, was the 60 years of love and discipline and grief and faithfulness that those 5 shots were carrying. The lesson is older than any of us. Do not measure a man by the wear on his rifle, or the limp in his step, or the dust on his truck. Measure him by what he has been carrying quietly while you were not paying attention. If this story moved you, hit the subscribe button now and stay for the next one, because there are more men like Walter Hennessy out there than you know, and we are going to find every one of them.